And Happy New Year to everyone, if that's not too late to say so. And I hope that 2022 is a better year for ourselves and for wildlife than perhaps 2021 and 2020 have so far proved to be. As I say, I know we had an apology for absence, at least initially, from Hannah Lawson, who hopes, I believe, to try and join the meeting later on if we're still in session. Emily, have we had any other apologies?
We have, Chair, yes. We've had apologies from Hannah Lawson, Irene Mann and Linda Tyler-Lloyd today.
Okay, but it looks like we've got a pretty good attendance, just looking down the participant list in front of me, which is a good sign. So going back to the agenda, number 2, disclosure of personal and prejudicial interests. Does anyone feel they have something they need to declare? I'd be very surprised. Okay, no sign of action there. Number 3, prohibition of whipped votes and declaration of party whips.
Chair, sorry.
Oh, morning, Mary.
So get your hands up.
Oh, you've got a hand up, you declaring.
I think I just need to, as I often have done, mention that I work for Gower Power Co-op, and we have a community benefit fund which often is used to help improve biodiversity. And I don't think it's a direct conflict of interest, but in case I mention something later on, it would be better if I've mentioned it first. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. I can't see how that's likely to conflict with this morning's agenda, but thank you for making that statement as a case in point. Thank you. So prohibition of whipped votes, declaration of party whips. I always find that slightly strange, but it's on the agenda, and I'll be surprised if there's anything there. So moving on then to minutes of previous meetings, we have the minutes of the last meeting of the panel, which was held on Wednesday, 6 October. Gosh, we're 3 months away now. Just going through, first of all, on questions of accuracy, is there anything on page 1? Page 2, water pollution, very long minute there on water pollution going right into page 3. And then a similarly long minute on local flood risk management, page 4, and into page 5. Are we happy that these are correct as a record of the discussion that took place? Thank you. Any comments on them, or are we happy to proceed? Thank you very much. They were both very informative and detailed discussions, as can be seen from the extent of the minute that Emily so carefully prepared for us. So, number 5, public questions. Emily, have we had any public questions?
No public questions today, Chair, no.
Okay, thank you for that. Which takes us on then to the main item of business for this morning's meeting, which is item 6, management of green space, weed and verge management. And obviously this is a big issue as far as this particular panel can be concerned. And I'd like to welcome yet again Councillor Mark Thomas, who I think has become a regular feature in our meetings, and a very welcome feature. Very welcome, Mark. Chris Howell, Head of Waste, Parks and Cleansing. I'm not sure. Yes, Jeremy Davis is here as well, and Mark Barber. And also I should mention Deb Hill, Head of Nature Conservation, who is also here. So there's quite a little team of officers in support of the paper. Who's going to introduce this paper? Are you going to do that, Mark?
Yes, if I may, Chair. I'm not quite sure that yeah, we've got a paper here for all members and the public and interested parties, obviously, but we have set it up slightly different than we would normally, and there's a reason for that, which I'm happy to explain. On the main agenda, the main item in front of you focuses on the weed management process we use throughout the authority. Many of you will be well versed in this because this is a repeat item for scrutiny. It's probably we discuss this on an annual basis. The reason the grass verge and green space management is on a separate appendix is because of in order to try and avoid duplication of work as much as anything else. But as some of you are aware, because you also sit on the PDC, this report was provided to the PDC working group on this subject only on the 16th of December. So it's quite recent. So we've obviously, in the lead up to the scrutiny meeting here today, we've got nothing new to add to that report in preparation for the scrutiny meeting. It's as is. It's only a month old, effectively, and that will explain in detail more about what we are doing and are committed to doing, and the implications and the complications of the challenges we face when we look at turning more of our grassed areas back to nature. And I think the public would be interested if they are listening and looking in today too, because I think there is a view generally that people think, well, if you want more biodiversity, all you have to do is let the grass grow. I wish it was that simple. And I think the report does go into detail, and it's very good because we have already carried out some trials, etc. So my thought, Chair, if you're happy, because we're on page 1 effectively of the report, is if I start off with the weed management part of it, which is a smaller part, and then we move on to the appendix, because that's obviously much more detailed. If you're comfortable with that, I'm happy to start.
Happy with that.
You know,
yeah.
And it'll save people flicking back and forth on their appendices and that as well. Obviously, on section 1 of the report, it talks about management of green spaces. Obviously, that'll be covered in detail and why we do it and what our commitments are, etc. But then weed management, really speaking, I'll try and be, I'm not trying to rush things at all, but to be sort of brief and succinct and to the point. This has obviously been a controversial subject and looked at by scrutiny for a number of years. We have tried wherever we can to reduce our reliance and use of glyphosates throughout our services. Predominantly, and the reason it's sectioned off from parks is because the biggest service user of glyphosate is highways. A lot of people may think that parks use glyphosate. We do in some cases, predominantly on the treatment of Japanese knotweed. That's where the bulk of usage goes within parks. But the biggest service user of glyphosate within the authority is the Highways Department. And again, for clarity, and a lot of generally the public wouldn't have any reason to understand this, the management of weeds predominantly is a matter for highways, not for parks. But it's because the major issues you get with weed treatment is on our roads rather than in our parklands. So therefore, that responsibility and liability falls onto highways, and they are then responsible for coordinating that. It's carried out on a 3-year contract. We use a contract company, I think they're based in Cardiff, that come in to do this work. It is done by machine. It is the most effective and efficient method that we've been able to discover, find, use. We have not been able to find any other alternative methods of clearing all our streets and pavements of weeds that comes anywhere near the current programme. Cost is obviously an issue. Resource is the major issue for this. To hand clear weeds throughout all our miles of streets and pavements would be a nigh on impossible task, and as we are today. Obviously, new technologies are being designed. We have taken part in some trials in previous years about new equipment or new treatments that are less aggressive than glyphosates and that. But to date, we haven't been able to find anything that we could substitute in the use of glyphosates. We have, I think, over a period of years, reduced the amount of glyphosate we use. I did see some time ago that overall usage of glyphosate was down by 50%. The machines that carry out this treatment are fitted with sensors, so that when they do spray, they don't spray on roads that haven't got weeds. They are sensitized to the presence of weeds, so they only spray where necessary rather than just randomly spraying along our streets and roads. There is, we are in the midst of looking at a new contract, and as always, whenever we look to renew or change a contract, we will always look to discuss what, if any, other methods are available to, again, it might not eliminate the use of glyphosates, but we're also always focusing on reducing the use and eventually possibly eliminating the use. And as I said, it's a market that is always coming up with innovative ideas, and we will always continue to do that. But as to date, we haven't been able to find any suitable alternatives. I mean, a point in mind is earlier this year we did have, I think it was during some of the storms, it was the first treatment of the year, I believe, which is normally due in about March, April. Wasn't able to be done. It was set back by 2 months because of continuous rain. As you're aware, you know, we can't spray when there's rain about, and we had an extensive period of storms and wet weather. And the outcome of that is that the weeds got out of hand. We received many complaints, and we had to put a lot of extra effort and resource into catching up effectively. So the option of not spraying is not something that we could consider as an authority at the moment, because you just simply, in a very short space of time, you have got weeds that get out of control, and the effort then to reduce or clear big weeds as opposed to reducing small weeds is much more troublesome. We have, to that point, highways have been afforded extra budget improvements to create a team now. They've got a hotspot team, for want of a better description, so that where there's areas of high, particularly around areas like junctions and roundabouts and difficult to get at places, we have this team. It is currently in operation. It is already working away, sort of behind the scenes almost. It's being used across the city and county of Swansea, based on known areas fed in by officers, really. It's from local knowledge through officers and hotspot areas. That is something we are planning to, it is our intention and always has been, to roll that out, particularly in the first place to ward members, so that you will have a contact, so that you can contact this team to come and look at, as I said, hotspots or difficult areas in your wards that are not perhaps covered by the routine maintenance. There's some back office operations. The hold up for that is we need to get that back office operation up and running. That's not in place yet. But as soon as we get that in place, there will be an opportunity in the first instance for ward councillors to feed in and say, well, can you direct this team to my ward to tackle these weeds? So that is something we are, quite excited about. It, as I said, it's already, and it's doing tremendous work out there at the moment, albeit largely some of it will be unseen, but you may notice work going on in your wards that is used to clear these, difficult and challenging areas. That's all I've got to say, Chair, at the moment on the weed management side of it. I'm quite happy, as always, to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's a very helpful and comprehensive review of the current position. I mean, we all know that the use of glyphosate is controversial. People have conflicting and strongly held views. I've certainly expressed strong views in the past. I know other members have as well, both for and against the use of glyphosate. And it is a difficult issue. We know that there's a potential health issue. And I'm sure the council, as we've just heard from Mark, is taking out many steps to ensure that that health issue doesn't occur, at least in Swansea. But there are issues, of course, in relation to wildlife as well, with which this panel is concerned, in terms of the use of the derogatory term weed, which may be a weed to us, but can be a source of food and sustenance for insects, and through insects to birds and others. So it's a tricky subject. Hazel, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I'd like to ask Mark a question, please. We've
Sure.
got a weed problem in Penlan. We've had it for some years. It's a sort of a fungus. It's not a plant, And I'm just wondering, if we don't know the name of the weed and what it's called, how can we, when we want to report it, what's the best way of doing that? And we just describe it to somebody and hope for the best?
Yeah, I can see Christine is indicating there with the camera. I mean, yeah, that might be useful if you can take photographs. Yeah. I mean, it may be. I mean, as some of you may or may not be aware, I'm sure the chair is aware. We've recently appointed a new biodiversity, Section 6 biodiversity officer. He's on the call now, Mark Barber. I'm sure this is something that may well be within his area of expertise, or even Deborah Hill, or if not, if we haven't got that expertise within the authority, we definitely will have contacts. I mean, report it in, Hazel, if you can. I mean, send it to perhaps Deborah in the first place. I'm just looking at the screen. Yeah, I'm sure there's something we can deal with. I'm just trying to think of the best reporting mechanism for you to do this. And I'm looking at, there may be one of the officers is going to stick their hand up and say, well, send it to me and I'll have a look at it. I don't know.
Well, it's not, it's sort of dyeing the pavements and the walls bright green. It's a sort of a moss. It's not a plant as I would describe it to you. We've had it about 4 or 5 years and it's unpleasant.
I can see Debbie's got her hand up, so perhaps, Chair, I'd be happy for Deb to come in and make some suggestions.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Deb,
And there's one other problem in Penlan. We've got an awful lot of foxes lately, and they seem to be carrying bad cases of mange. Should we report that to anyone? Because the mange can be transferred to household pets, can't it?
Right. I don't know if Deb Hill will be able to answer that one, but if Deb answers your first questions, and then we'll have a think about how best to report the fox issue. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, certainly, by all means, if you could take a photo and email it or WhatsApp it to our team, we'll be able to find somebody who can identify whatever it is and what's the best way of dealing with it. There are a lot of other phone apps out there that help you to identify plants and animal species, which perhaps, I don't know, Mark might be able to say more on that, but we can certainly send details and links to those apps, because wherever possible, it is good, even if it's not a problematic species, to, if you see something interesting, to send your records through to the Central Records Centre, and that all helps to build up that information. As regards foxes, no, it's not something I know much about. I'd say it's more of a welfare issue, and probably something for the RSPCA perhaps, or I don't know on that one. But Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I would just add, that there are apps available out there which people can use to identify stuff, but please do email me any photographs you've got. In terms of the foxes, I'm not quite sure about mange and getting into domestic pets, but I think, the RSPCA might be the people to let know about that if there are foxes which are clearly very unhealthy.
Okay, is that okay, Hazel?
Yes, that's fine, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, Wendy, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I tend to agree in part with, concerns about the use of glyphosate, but like Mark has said, how do we deal with weeds? And I know we're getting on to things like grass cutting, but I have quite a lot of grass verges in my ward, and when they're in residential areas, of course, people get very uptight if they're not cut properly. But also then, my experience is that when the verges are not cut along the curb edge, if you can envisage this, the grass and weeds grow, they hang over the curb edge, and then they seem to root quite successfully in the edges of the road, because often the edges of the roads are crumbly, aren't they? And weeds are very, very effective at taking root. So there is this perennial problem of, if the grass is cut, but the curb edges don't get included in that cut and continue to grow, the weeds root in the gutters, and then we have this weed problem which then needs spraying. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, Mark. I go out with my little hoe and my barrow. My road is clear of weeds, and I advance into other areas as well. I've had whole edges sealed with this tarmac arrangement. The weeds are winning. They're still coming through. So there doesn't seem to be an easy solution apart from glyphosate. And as I say, I have reservations, but I just don't know what the answer is. We don't, as you have pointed out, have men with hose and barrels going around every area. So that really was a comment, you know. Other people may have the same experience.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. Do either of, I was looking particularly either Jeremy Davis or Chris Howell have a view on the point that Wendy has just made about curb edge weed growing as a problem? And do they have a solution to it?
Chair, maybe if I pick that one up. I think Wendy's right. We don't have operatives with hose and barrows to be able to cover every kilometre of highway network. So when we cut the verges with ride-on mowers, inevitably those machines don't form a neat edge at the curbside. But a lot of weed growth is not necessarily only from the verge. It can be from a lot of other sources as well, and it's about having a growing medium available for it. And unfortunately, as Wendy stated, sometimes the join between the curb and the road creates that little gap, which weeds will take hold in. And the only solution that is really available at the moment is spraying.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Deb, you've still got your hand up. Did you want to comment on this issue?
Apologies, no, I should have taken it down. I think Mary has, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, Christine, I think, was next, so I'll take Christine and then Mary Sherwood. Christine.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you everyone for citing this report, and I think an interesting discussion today surrounding weeds. Like, you know, as ward members, we know that, you know, residents can get up in arms when a weed shows its face. Should I say? But having said that, when we're talking about glyphosates, of course, we've got the weeds such as Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam that we have to deal with as well, and that raises its ugly head. As the owner of a field out the back of my house, I have a grudging respect for Japanese knotweed, and if it was a useful plant, it would be brilliant because it's an absolute survivor no matter what you do to it. So I think when we're thinking of spraying, certainly those weeds, the Himalayan balsam and the Japanese knotweed, kind of stand apart from your regular weeds, do they not? In my ward, I think it was last year or the year before, years have merged into one now, and I have difficulty sorting out which year we're talking about, but certainly the back slope of Lougher Castle was left uncut either side, and it was a pleasure to see that in that thick lush grass that grew up, we had orchids and we had primroses that were there and hiding, shall we say, in the normal course of things. And so, I mean, you know, that was a pleasure to see. It was also a bit of you know, it was a bit of a wizard weeds, because when the back of that, you know, when that's cut and the grass is left, especially when we've got dry weather, because we have had some youngsters in our area thought it was fun to gather it all together and set it on fire, of course. So there's that as well. What I did want to talk about this morning is when we're talking about managing green spaces. I was interested recently to find out that an area that I thought, the banks of Lougher Castle, in fact, was highways land, not parks. And there was a plan in place to actually sell off a strip 7 metres wide, which I would consider to be green open space in my ward, but which is listed as highways land. And it was going to be sold to a resident who wanted to turn it into, I suppose, a hard standing for his cars. so when we're talking about green spaces, I know that now that highways and parks and everything come under your remit, Mark, and bless you for that, because you yeah, bless you for that. But it seems to me that in the admin, some of our green spaces are labelled highways land, and we treat it differently to other of our spaces that are labelled parks or public green open spaces. And clearly not straight away, but I believe that sometime we need to get this house in order, because the Castle Bank is not highways in my, it's a green open space. And I'm sorry to use this scrutiny committee to raise this, but you may well find that there are other green open spaces all across the length and breadth of City and County of Swansea that are labelled highways and are being dealt with maybe in a different way to what we would expect them to be dealt with.
Thank you, Christine. You shouldn't apologise, I think, for raising it in this meeting. It seems to be entirely appropriate for scrutiny. It may well be that the council needs to think about the structure of responsibility for different.
I mean, it was pure chance that I found out just by talking to the chap who lives in the house. I mean, if he'd asked for land the other side of his house, it's in Park Williams, and I'm sure he would have said, go away, don't be so silly. But because it was in land that was designated highways, we nearly lost a significant patch of green open space to someone who wanted to use it as a car park.
I think it's a point to be recorded, please, Emily, in the minutes of this meeting, because we may well want to take it further at a later date. So thank you, Christine, for that.
Could I respond partly on that, please, Chair? There's an added complication to this. Now, I'm not familiar with what's gone on at the banks of the castle there in Lecker specifically, but the council over the many years has carried out an asset management programme. Some of you may be familiar with. So it's done a recording of all of its assets, and those assets it wants to retain, and those assets that may be marked for disposal. Now, they are broad and wide, and they are not specific on land ownership. So they might be, asset management surveys will have taken place in education, education land, housing land, highways and parks, etc. So I don't know about this specific, but I'm not aware that highways is selling land in that location. Now, I wouldn't necessarily, but what it could be, and I'm just suggesting it may have been earmarked as part of an asset allocation disposal, and therefore, estates may have been managing it. But that may be, I don't know. But certainly, I understand what Christine is saying about the crossover in some cases between parks and highways, but the ownership of land in the city falls in between about 5 different areas. Parks and highways are obviously 2, but as I said, education, housing, and then estates land as well. And there's certain parks, because although we are responsible for parks, we are not responsible for parks, for example, in the UAMB necessarily. So it is a challenging area, and I respect everything that Christine is saying about this, and I'm more than happy to look into this particular matter for her. But I at this moment in time, I'm not familiar with that case, Chair.
Yeah,
Christine.
Sorry to go on. Right, I think it was the resident approached the council.
Right. Okay.
With regard to this. And the council were very happy to sell a strip 6 metres wide, which is a significant strip of land when you're talking, okay. 6 metres wide and about 20 metres long, I think, so it was, but it was only purely by chance that I found out by talking to my neighbour across the road, who said, oh, I'm buying a patch of land. I thought, oh, really?
Okay. Yeah, well, that on that case, then it may be a relevant point, so that if that opportunity occurs anywhere else, that people are aware of it. I was certainly not aware of it, and obviously you were not aware of it.
The staff, Mark, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I think we're agreed that Mark will look into it separately with Christine and resolve it. Yeah, thank you. Moving on, if I may, just to remind members, at the moment we're looking at weed management and verge management, if you like, and then we'll come on to green open space once we've completed that. Mary Sherwood. Mary.
Thanks, Chair. Christine, you can eat knotweed. I understand it tastes like rhubarb and you should cook it a certain way. But actually, I don't think that the careful kind of root injection of glyphosate into knotweed in quite controlled areas where knotweed is a problem, I don't think that's really what most people around Swansea are concerned about. I think there's an acknowledgement that that's the only fix we have for that kind of invasive species. A farmer who has a business doing ecological fences on where you've got
breaking up. I lost you, Mary.
Yeah. Eat everything above ground level, and then he sends in pigs, and the pigs dig out the roots, and then they put down a bespoke seed mix which controls any invasive species that had previously been in that area. And he says it's very successful for controlling knotweed. I think that sounds remarkable, and I think that that's something that we should find out more about. But at the moment, I understand that we do use glyphosate to control invasive species. But I think what most people are worried about more than that is the buggy coming along and spraying the pavement area, and then 10 minutes later someone comes along with a pushchair, or someone comes along walking their dog, but where it's really kind of literally in the faces of residents is where it's more of a worry for people. So I know that people do complain. So I know that weed spraying isn't always effective, and people will complain. So with regard to the complaining, I know that campaign called Nature Isn't Neat. They rolled out prior to reducing their mowing.
Losing you again, Mary. I've lost you, Mary.
And they did that to get the public on board with the concept that the council should consider doing something simple.
Mary, you're having serious problems, I think, in your audio. Certainly I have.
I have too, Chair. Can't hear anything.
No, I can't hear her.
She turns her camera off. It might
Mary, Mary Sherwood, could I suggest you switch off and come back on again? You might find that will improve. And we'll get back to your point in a moment. While you're doing that, if I could turn to the other Mary Jones. Mary Jones.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the point we've all been talking about is the glyphosate. And of course, when we first started using it, we weren't aware of the dangers. And I know over the years now we've reduced the usage of it. But my fear is that something new will come on the market, and then in I don't know how many years' time, that'll be found to be dangerous. So we need to be very careful what we're looking at to replace glyphosate. We do know the dangers of glyphosate. We do use it under very strict controls. And sometimes I think, oh, yes, we must move on to something else. It might not be the best thing to do. And the other thing is, when you're looking at the contract, if you're renewing it, can you tell them that there are cul-de-sacs in Swansea? Because for some unknown reason, they do the main roads, but they miss out, especially around here,
cul-de-sac, and that's been over a number of years. We've had to go back and ask for them to come back out. That is not an effective or efficient way of using something. I know they might only target weeds, but they're not actually targeting anything if they're missing the whole area out. So it's a point for you to consider when you're looking to renew the contract. Thank you.
Mark Thomas, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, yes, please. I mean, first of all, and it's particularly for, you know, councillors will be aware, but members of the public who might be looking in, although we talk about the dangers and the use and the nervousness about glyphosate, you know, importantly, it is a fully licensed, authorised product that we are using, although there are question marks and serious question marks over its use. I have to say that it is a fully licensed product that is being used. You know, we're not using an unsafe product on our streets and highways. Picking up on Mary's question about cul-de-sacs, yeah, you know, there is a programme of work. All of our streets, cul-de-sacs, side roads, etc., are included. All our adopted highway is included in this programme. And I would urge ward councillors, if you're aware, and it does happen occasionally, that, you know, because we've set up this programme of the 3 sprays throughout the year when they are likely to be in your ward, is a very tricky one, I understand, because we may say that they will be in Calais in June, and they don't eventually get there till July, because if we've had several weeks of rain, everything is put back. And it's not a programme we can control that accurately. But when they're in your ward, if you're aware, or, you know, residents say to you that they haven't been here, or after they've been in your ward and you see no, you know, deterioration in the weed there, then we will get them back, and we do that. That's part of the contract. If we are not satisfied with the treatment that they put down, we will, you know, ask the company come back and retreat or treat, in the first instance, a street or a cul-de-sac that they've missed out. So it's just keeping an eye on it. You know, as I said, we are paying for a service of all our adopted highway. If that isn't done, we won't hesitate, and haven't hesitated in the past, in getting them back to retreat, you know, to retreat areas they've missed or they have not covered properly.
Thank you, Mark. We do that, but it's not really very efficient, is it? If we've got to keep asking them to come back.
No, you shouldn't have to do it. No, you're quite right.
They are, you know, missing out. And I'm sure we're not the only ones. It must be across the city. And as you said, we're paying for a service.
You're muted, Mary. Oh, okay. Sorry, your last remarks were lost, Mary. I think you accidentally muted.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You're
muted again, Mary.
My cursor's not anywhere near it. I don't know why somebody's knocking me off. I'll let you go on to the next speaker.
Yes, could I go back? Mary Sherwood, are you in a better position now to sum up on what you're trying to say?
I think perhaps my internet doesn't like it if I show my face and speak at the same time. So I think if I'll just keep my camera off, and that might be better.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I agree with Mary that any new chemical that we find is likely to then be a cause of concern. And in any case, I think from previous conversations with officers, I know that spraying isn't really ideal. And actually, people with hose do a much better job. And I might, you know, long for a time when the council has the funding to actually employ people to keep on top of this, as happened in the good old days. But failing that, I know that there are lots of people around the community who would go out and do a little bit of weeding. So on the one hand, I would encourage the council to consider a Nature Isn't Neat campaign, following in the example of some other Welsh councils that have found that very successful in helping people be a bit more tolerant of weeds, and not so concerned if they've not been caught by the sprayer. But obviously, in some locations, they can be a bit dangerous. They can destabilise front garden walls and paving slabs and things like that, and they do need to be dealt with. But then actually digging them out is more effective than spraying them. So I'm sure Chris Howell might remember that June Birdshaw and I worked with him some years ago to produce a guidance note for local members who want to support volunteers in their neighbourhood to do weeding, basically, as well as litter picking and leaf clearance and whatever kind of environmental cleanup jobs neighbours might want to do together. I'm not sure where that leaflet is or how easy it is for us to access it, but it would be nice to see that resurfaced. I was at a meeting at the weekend of Uplands Living Streets, which is a branch of a national charity formerly called the Pedestrian Association. And there was a lot of interest there in requesting that Uplands doesn't get weed sprayed. And I know that that's something that was negotiated also a couple of years ago, was that wards can opt out of spraying if the neighbourhood, if the community feel that strongly that they don't want the glyphosate treatment, wards can opt out of it. But then on the member's head be it if people do start having problems and making complaints. Uplands Living Streets is going to be reaching out to a number of local partners, including Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, the churches, everybody that we can think of, who might ask whether their members and networks would put people forward to volunteer to help with this. And you only need one or two sort of champions with hose on each street to perhaps chivvy other neighbours into joining in. And actually, I think it could be, it could have some merit. It could have some merit, and I think if Uplands manages to do a sort of pilot with this or get a lot of interest, I will report back and share that, because people do remark on the days when everybody used to keep the street outside their house clear, and if everybody did that again, what a burden it would take off the local authority. But you have to see a culture change, don't you? And but the first thing we could do as a council is to signal to people that they're welcome to get involved and that their involvement would be appreciated. And by doing that, we might be able to reduce the weed spraying, perhaps not eliminate it altogether, but target it in a way that it's not as widespread as it is now. And that might provide some comfort to the public. Thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mary. I think that's an interesting and, in my view, excellent idea. And I know in my own ward of Scrutiny, and certainly in significant parts of Scrutiny, because Scrutiny is very mixed, but certainly in parts of Scrutiny, there would also be support for that kind of approach. So I think if Uplands can pilot something along those lines, I think that'd be extremely helpful. Mark, you want to comment?
Yeah, just if I could, just on that point, and Mary makes a valid point there, and I have mentioned it at previous scrutinies, because the option to sort of opt out of weed spraying has been there for a couple of years now. Now, to give encouragement, I do understand that the thought of how do you opt out as a ward is a big ask. I mean, that's it. But I have made the offer, I mentioned it in previous scrutiny meetings, and I think at council on questions, that you can opt out. It doesn't have to be the size and scale of a ward. What we can't deal with is, can you not spray out outside numbers 1 and 2 of Penclough Road, for example, right? We can't. But if you are in a position, and this is by way of encouragement for this community buy-in and community support, because that's what we're referring to here. In the absence of the council currently being unable to do this, it does then rely on the community, volunteers, partner organisations, etc., to get involved. But you can do it by street, and we can manage that programme by street. So what we can't do is outside numbers 1 and 2 sort of thing, because this is a computerised system. But we can certainly take out streets. We can take out areas or zones within wards. It isn't a take it or leave it on it, because I as a ward councillor, if I was given the option of taking my whole ward out of a programme, I wouldn't be able to manage substituting that in the short term. Perhaps it's a long-term aim, but if I was to do anything in that scope, I'd be looking at the street that I live, or a street that I'm close to, or a street where I know I've had several volunteers coming forward. And we can do that, and we can put that into the programme if councillors so wish. And I suggest that you look, perhaps, and look, if Uplands have got a programme in place where they're going to do something like this, and I'm sure that'll be great, because it's something we can advertise across the council, and all ward councillors can look at it and how did they do it and what's needed. But I think it needs to be obviously then sustainable. It's look, if it doesn't work for whatever reason over a period of time, we can reinstate it into the programme. But you'd be doing this You know, this isn't something you'd be encouraging residents to do this year. This is something you'd start off looking as a long-term commitment. But as I said, if you try it and it doesn't work, you haven't lost nothing, because we can put it back in the following year. So, but I'd certainly encourage it. But you can break it down into chunk-sized pieces that we can program into these computerized models, so that the weed sprayer doesn't visit that area, you know.
Thank you, Mark. Mary, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Mark for that reassurance, because we were very daunted at the thought of cancelling weed spraying for the entire ward and being responsible for that whole area. And I didn't realise that you could just request to stop spraying on particular streets. That makes our little pilot project seem a lot more manageable. So I'm very grateful for that clarification. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Mary. I think that's been a very useful discussion, and will be appropriately minuted and reported. And I think we wait to see the outcome of your pilot in Uplands as to whether that can be developed more widely into other areas or not. But I like the idea of a street-based approach, which I would agree with Mark. It does sound to me to be a practicable way of operating, and will help to meet the problem that we have, that some areas or streets would welcome the use of glyphosate, and others would prefer not to have it in their areas and look after the weeds along their road themselves. Are there any other points on weed management, or can we move on to green spaces, which is the other part of our agenda? I think we've had a good discussion. Okay, if we can move on then to the document that was received by the PDC back in mid-December last. I was present at that meeting. I find myself in a slightly odd position of being part of a discussion and then coming along to Scrutiny to scrutinise a discussion that I was part of, and I hope that's nevertheless okay. Mark, do you want to introduce this paper?
Yes, just briefly again, Chair, because as I said, I'm sure all members have read it, and some of you, like yourself, would have been present at the PDC in December, where it would have been gone through in some detail. But I mean, you know, we put it into bite-sized pieces, into sections there. Section 1 is about, you know, what we do, why we do it, what our responsibilities are, not only under duty, but under responsibilities of what we signed up and the commitments we've made as an authority, like signing up to climate emergency, and the moral duty that we have to take this issue of biodiversity and improving and increasing that across the width and breadth of Swansea. A commitment I am prepared to make. This, you know, I'm certainly keen, and I believe there is definite appetite within the public. There's definitely appetite within the cabinet that we look at creating more areas where wildlife can flourish, and on this particular subject, predominantly by leaving areas of grass grow longer. Now, having said that, as I said in my preamble much earlier on in the start of the meeting, is I wish it was as simple as just leaving grass grow longer. Now, if you look at the document and go through it, there are many reasons why we can't simply do that. One of the most important ones, and look, I'll welcome when I finish. I mean, if officers want to come in with particularly people, you know, with a detailed interest and knowledge of this, I'm more than happy to give way to them. But I'll just pick on the key themes. Is one of the biggest challenges, and this is for public awareness as much as anything else, is that if you leave grass grow and just don't attend to it, very often, as many of us will know, in some non-council-owned parts of land, we've all got little patches of land that are sort of owned by somebody who yet to be discovered and uncared for. You end up with pickies, and thistles, and stinging nettles, and Japanese knotweed, and all other sort of species growing in that. It very rarely becomes just long grass. It tends to be and can be an unkept area unless you have some form of management of it. Secondly, if you then cut the grass and leave it, it puts nutrients back into the earth, into the land, which is counterproductive to natural wildflower growing. They want nutrient-reduced land to flourish in, not nutrient-rich land. So when we do leave grass to grow, which is what we are going to be doing, we then have to make sure that when we do cut it, we have to remove it. When we have to remove it, we need specialist equipment, which up until recently we haven't had. And through Welsh Government funding of somewhere in the region of £176,000, I think it is, we've been able to buy some of that cut and collect equipment, including tractors, flails, etc., for the big sites and smaller hand-controlled machines for the verges and smaller areas. That equipment is already deployed, as it says in the programme of work here, and we are evaluating the trials that have been taking place already in 21. Following on from that, we have a programme, as highlighted here in the appendix, of what we plan to do for 22. And again, it's not there to show the problems. I don't see them as problems. I see them as challenges. Okay, and much for the public to say, we are with you. We are looking at this. This is something we do want to do. But for example, a problem that 2 years ago I wouldn't have foreseen this, for example, is that when we leave areas of grass grow and then we cut and collect, we have an issue in the collection and the disposal of those. We're not talking about a bit of grass. In Singleton, I think it was, I haven't got the page up with me now, I think it's 80 tons of grass we had to remove. No. And then you have to dispose of that grass. You can't just, as I said, you can't just leave it there, and you can't put 80 tons of grass in a pile in the corner of Singleton Park either. So there are, again, there are obviously cost implications to that, but there are resource, complications to that. And so it's a very complicated, for what should be relatively a simple process of leaving grass grow. As you could read the report, it isn't as straightforward as that. The other side of it, which I'm also very keen on, is that, and I think we've got stung a bit in the past. Many years ago, we decided to leave some areas in wards go to meadow effectively. I think the part that was missing there is that we didn't involve the local members or didn't involve the local community. So what is seen by the public, unless you inform them differently, is if you don't cut the grass, the public look at that as the council saving costs, saving money, cutting costs, or can't be bothered to cut the grass in their area, when that's simply not the case. So what we need to do is, when we decide that we are going to leave areas go to meadow, whether they're in parks, whether they're grass verges, we need to inform certainly the ward councillors and the community in which they save. And I think there's a absolutely different reaction you'll get from the public when you say to the public, we are leaving that area of grass grow to improve and increase our biodiversity, improve nature. The reaction to that will be, I'm confident, will be totally different than just leaving it grow and not informing anybody. And that buy-in and support from the public, I think, is vital. And I believe we will get it. I mean, there may be some areas where people say, well, what about this bit or that bit? And you might get down to how much areas you leave. But in principle, I think we have got the general support of the public for managed meadows and verges. Obviously, on a sort of safety point of view, we can't let all grass verges just go along, because there are certain, we do have to do risk assessments. So some of them are subject to highway management measures where we have to have visibility splays and things like that, right? So you can't just leave grass grow. But, in a nutshell, Chair, those are the key points I wanted to highlight. As I said, we are very keen within the Park Service to do this. This is something we're all bought into. It's a resolve from the Cabinet as well. But I think, as well as wanting to do it, let's do it right. Let's get support and the buy-in of the public in doing this. And that by explaining, as I said previously, what we're doing and why we're doing it, I'm sure that support and buy-in from the public and ward councillors will be forthcoming.
Thank you, Mark. I must say I agree entirely with your supposition about public support. I think, given a proper understanding of what the council is trying to do in these circumstances, there will be widespread support. I think there's a growing public recognition of the importance of protecting and supporting biodiversity recovery from the losses we've had in recent decades, and a realisation, therefore, of support for the kind of measures that you've just outlined. I don't see any hands up. Could I just ask? Sorry, I do have a hand up. Steve, you've intervened. Steve Gallagher.
Mark, thank you for that. And I must say, I totally agree with your comments. we've got to let the community know what's going on, and 100% biodiversity is the future. You know, I got young grandchildren, and that's all they tell me about, and they tell me things I haven't got a clue what they're talking about. However, what I am really, I'm proud of Swansea, like all of us. The entrances to Swansea, particularly Fabian Way, and I'm not talking about the Neathport Talbot side, but our side, should be pristine, and is showing you are coming into a city which is proud of itself. For visitors, we can get the message out to residents 100%, but I think the first impression of a visitor, particularly with the money that we're spending and, you know, the arena, etc., that's going on in the city centre, we've got to have that. And then elsewhere, we can sort of say, this is what we are in the city, but please come in to a city which is proud of itself. I know it seems to go against what you were saying, but at the same time, I think we've got to recognise those issues as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Steve. That's an interesting observation on the wider issue. But let's not forget also we are a biodiversity and nature recovery panel, but I fully understand where Steve is coming from, and I think he's right in terms of public presentation, particularly for visitors, which I think is a different issue from residents understanding why we may choose to take protective measures for biodiversity in their particular area. So thank you, Steve, for that. Wendy Fitzgerald.
Thank you. Yes, I think Mark has put a very compelling case in terms of what we perhaps can do in our wards to inform residents. You know, if an area is going to be left uncut, and that is obviously going to be happening if we want to increase our biodiversity. And certainly in my ward, we are going to be losing a huge amount of biodiversity, hedgerows, grass, open space, because of all the house building that is going to take place. So it's a very, very sad scenario, but that is the reality of where we are. One thing I wanted to ask was, now Mark has said that when you cut the grass, you've got to remove it if you want to stop the nutrients going back into the soil. And I fully understand that. What I'm wondering, when you cut verges within residential areas and you don't collect the grass, then presumably the uncut grass, which sometimes in my ward looks as though we've got hay, it is presumably feeding the soil and therefore encouraging more luxuriant grass to grow, which will shortly need cutting again. You know, I understand that removing the grass that has been cut is going to cost money and involve resources. But on the other hand, if we were to remove the cut grass, would that reduce the number of potential cuts that would be needed if the growing grass didn't receive all the fertilization? I'm just wondering, because I seem to have very luxuriant verges in a lot of residential areas, and they do grow quite profusely. And you know, cutting when they are cut, they are in desperate need of cutting. You know, have you got any comments, Mark? Any suggestions, ideas?
Yeah, if I may, Chair, respond. Yeah, I mean, Councillor Fitzgerald is right. Yes, if you leave the grass there, it's going to encourage more growth. Just to differentiate, for clarification, when we're talking about cutting and removing, we are talking about wild meadow and wildflower sites to encourage those natural flowers and plants to grow, as opposed to what are clearly grassed areas.
Absolutely.
But
yeah.
Still, the argument remains. Yeah, I suggest, and perhaps I'll defer to Jeremy on this on numbers, but I suggest that there is a price to pay by us as an authority by leaving the grass on grass verges.
Yep.
It results in us probably having to cut, I would guess, more often than if we completely removed it because it's feeding the soil. But I'm sure that, you know, Chris or Jeremy will be able to come in with detailed answers on that, but that would be my suggestion. But you have to look at it as a whole. Do you invest the time in cutting and collecting versus just cutting and being free to cut more often? But perhaps one of the officers will certainly be more educated and give a more accurate response than I'm able to on that one.
Chris Howell, I see you've got your hand up. If you'd like to respond, please.
Yes, thanks, Chair. The thought is that what Wendy's saying is right, is that if you keep collecting grass, then potentially the grass that's left will grow more slowly. And this is really what part of the trials that we're looking to undertake will determine. At the moment, we are really making an assumption that would be quite a low significance on the basis that, and it is only anecdotal, but certainly when I cut my lawn, I collect the grass every time I cut it. I've been doing so for years and I'm still cutting it just as frequently as I used to. So I think that you would feel that, and I think it is accepted that it does reduce the nutrient level, and that encourages the growth of native wildflowers. But I think it would be a risk to think then that we should do that everywhere, and then somehow we'd only be cutting the verges 2 or 3 times a year instead of 7 or 8. I don't think that's likely to be the case, albeit, where we are managing verges and collecting, time will tell.
Thank you, Chris. Just on this particular growth issue, do either Deb Hill or Mark Barber have a view that they might want to share with the panel in terms of the consequences of cutting or not cutting?
Shall I just jump first and then I'll pass to Mark, because he's really been working more closely with parks on this and has got a more detailed knowledge. But I think, absolutely right, that is the theory. You reduce the nutrient level and you reduce the biomass that you need to take off each time you cut. I think there's been quite a lot of trials done elsewhere in the UK and in Wales that have shown that this has really worked very well. And also considering when we're sort of developing new schemes, new road schemes, not to perhaps specify depths of topsoil for new verges, because you're just setting up a problem, a long-term maintenance problem. So it's not just about what we do with our existing verges, it's looking at perhaps the spec for some of the new schemes that we don't build in that kind of ongoing maintenance requirement. But if I can ask Mark to add anything to that in terms of the monitoring and surveying perhaps, and the evidence.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add was I think that the difference between cutting your own lawn on a regular basis and still the grass keeps growing is when it comes to managing green areas for wildflowers. By allowing the grass to go really long first and then cutting it and then doing that multiple times over the year, you're really allowing, you're making all of the goodness in the roots of the grass come up, and you're kind of shocking the grass and knocking it back. And then over the years, that means there's less grass and more wildflowers. Whereas if you just keep cutting the grass all the time, even if you're taking the arisings away, like on your lawn, all of the power of the grass is still in the roots. So that's why you get that difference. So it only really works in terms of collecting is if you allow the grass to go longer first. That's all I was going to say about that.
Okay, thank you. Wendy, you've got any thoughts finally?
Well, Chair, just one other comment I would ask. I think it's been very helpful and interesting what has been answered, but I was going to point out too that one of the other problems from not clearing and removing the grass, the cut grass, is that when the grass is long, and being cut, it sprays onto the road, shall I say. Then it gets swept into the gutters, and then, surprise, surprise, it washes down into the gullies. And I have found that I've had various gullies blocked at various times, not just with leaves, but with grass cuttings. So, it is just something perhaps we need to be aware of. There are other consequences of cutting grass and not collecting it, shall I say.
Thanks, Wendy. I would remind the panel that I thought we were focusing now on green open spaces and that we'd finished our discussion about verges, but nevertheless, Wendy, I take your point. And indeed, as someone who represents, along with Steve, Sketty Ward, which of course includes Singleton Park, I've been very impressed by the effects over the last 2 or 3 years of leaving large areas uncut to allow the grass to grow to full height and to seed and so forth, whilst cutting pathways through, which have been used by walkers and their dogs and so forth, and it's worked extremely well, and I hope to the benefit of biodiversity, whilst also ensuring that people can make best use of the park. So I'm very encouraged by the steps that the council has taken in Singleton, I'm sure in other parks along those lines. Moving on then, Christine Richard. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And clearly this is where I should have been talking about the item I was talking about earlier.
Indeed.
But, yeah, a bit overeager this morning. It was striking me when we were talking about areas in wards that could be left, that there's potential, if we're talking about the the involvement of local ward members, it seems to me there's a synergy between, I mean, we're coming up to the time of year where we'll all start ordering patches of wildflowers in our wards, and it strikes me there's a synergy between that and maybe ward members identifying patches in their wards that can be left. It just strikes me that maybe that's something that we can consider. I mean, if we're thinking about where we can sow wildflowers, maybe there's something close by where you can also like not bother cutting it for the season or what have you. I just throw that in there. Wendy mentioned buildings and planning and and development and houses, and maybe there's something that we should be looking at when we're talking about 106 agreements with developers. I know that we include at the moment things, they've got to leave green space and all the rest of it. I know how upset you are, Wendy, and I agree with you about the trees and all of that, but certainly maybe we need to tighten up on what we do with our conditions when we're talking about developments, if we're looking at biodiversity and green open spaces. And the last thing I've got to mention is I think Lacha Foreshore is probably an area that we could utilise. It was a wild space that's been tamed a little bit, but it's still very much a wild open space, and although most of it is in Councillor Robert Smith's ward, I'm sure that he'd be open to using that as a pilot for biodiversity and all the rest of it, because there's quite a lot of open space there. That's all, but it's interesting, and it's something that I'm interested in, and will continue to be interested in, even in the longer term. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I'm sure we've all got in our wards green areas that we might need to think about in terms of possible development for biodiversity rather than against biodiversity. I know in my own ward I have an area called a triangular field, so called because it is a triangle. And we've only started thinking about it in the last 12 months or so. And we've got a local volunteer group now set up to look after it. We've been in touch with the Woodland Trust. They're providing us with 300 whips initially to plant, and we've been busy doing that. We're going to plant an orchard in a corner of that field. We're going to sow wildflowers, and so on and so on. And there must be other areas where similar developments can take place across Swansea. So how we think about identify and use our green open spaces, however big or small, it's important, and it's important for biodiversity.
Chair, before can I just come in and respond on Councillor Richard's comments there? Look, and yes, Christine is picking up on the theme of what we're talking about. However, can I just urge a little bit of caution at the moment, because it's all about timing, resources, infrastructure, and all that. Because if you look at this matter is being explored and looked at by the PDC. and the end result hopefully will be that there's a policy that's adopted by the council. In the meantime, while that is in motion, and that's what we're looking to as an outcome, the Park Service did start trial areas in leaving going to meadow this in 21, and they've got further expansion and examination of the result of those trial areas this year. What we wouldn't be able to deal with at this moment in time is ward members coming forward, although I encourage the thought process, and I encourage, because this is what we need and want to do, is ward councillors volunteer in spaces that they are happy. I know of several areas in my ward that I'd be happy to leave go to meadow. But if because they will then require this once, twice or three times a year designated cut after they've grown long to create wild meadow, etc., there is a management effort required in doing that. So it's a bit chicken and egg. We would like to get the trials underway and find out where they're successful, where it's less successful, and some of the comments that's already been made by Mark, and Deb about, and Chris about where we are so far. We're trying to find out the best way to manage these areas, what works where, etc., and then having that support in place to roll that out to the ward. So it's just a bit. Now that doesn't stop the example of what you've said, Chair, about a community group doing anything within the ward and designating that area, and then that community group or friends of managing that. Yeah. But where it will require us to do cut and collect services, our cut and collect abilities at the moment are being used for these trial areas. So, it could be a bit of a challenge. So that's the only sort of slight bit of caution. I don't want to dampen down the enthusiasm of ward members and residents to do this. But at the moment, can I just suggest that we start looking within the wards at where you would like and where you think it would happen? Because, I mean, the outcome of all of this, I'm hoping, is that if it's adopted as a policy by the council, then it will become a requirement that certain areas of every ward will have to be left aside. It won't be a choice of, I don't want it, full stop. I'm expecting that there'll be total support across all wards in Swansea to some setting aside of grassed areas and verges where it's applicable to improve our nature and increase our biodiversity. So it won't be a question of, do you want some of this in your ward? My expectation will be this is going to happen, but we want to work with you as to what areas of your wards you'd be happy and the public would want set aside, rather than us telling you as a park service, this is what we're doing. But at the moment, I don't think. I mean, I don't know if any of the officers want to come in, but I don't think we'd be able to cope with requests from ward councillors at this moment in time.
Thank you, Mark. I think those are very helpful comments in relation to the forward thinking that I expect, I hope, the council will want to take in relation to this paper and its implications for particularly the identification of sites, as referenced, I think it's in paragraph 2.1, in terms of identification of sites, cutting options for those sites, how to treat them and so forth. I'm sure that will be the way forward, and I'll be surprised if the Cabinet don't accept that approach. Moving on then, Will Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. It's a very quick point. I have brought it up before in the past, and I'm just wondering if it's something that we can look at doing. Mark, you mentioned about the sort of PR battle with our constituents when it comes to letting the grass grow and meadow and the cut and collect, and I'm just wondering if there's not anywhere that we could put some signs in somewhere and just say they don't have to be in place for forever and a day, just initially to say this is a bee friendly area, we are allowing this to go to meadow, find out more information here, and put some sort of signs into places that I think that might help the communication with people, and they might then understand what the council's trying to achieve. So just a point on that, really. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think we're doing that already, Mark.
Yeah, I certainly, when we are doing the new cut and collect services and all that, and we're out without new machines and failures. It's actually in the report. We've got some photographs there. We do, when we're on site, we're advertising that it's on our machinery. We've got leaflets that we're happy to give out to any residents walking by. But I take your point, Will, is that I'm certainly supportive of, and just to make it clear, my impression of signs would be wooden stakes in the ground on a temporary basis. We don't want to be putting metal posts and infrastructure in, which is counterproductive. But certainly for people who we haven't reached is, yes, if you designate an area of park, for example, or a roadside verge that's left to go to meadow, a few stakes in the ground, simple sort of things with just saying, this is what we're doing and this is why. I mean, they don't need to be there long term. I would imagine that for a community benefit, after 1 year or something like that, if they rot down or if they removed, people will understand by then what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, but I'm very supportive of that, and that would be a relatively simple thing to do. And as I said, we're already using that sort of approach when we're out in the communities now in these trial areas, telling people what we're doing and why we're doing it. So it's a follow-on from that. So I'd be more than happy to look at including that in our project work going forward, definitely.
Thanks. Well, I think a little QR code that people could scan and get a link to a website on that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's a very useful little discussion, and I'm sure we'd all support the kind of signage approach that Will is trying to encourage, and to develop that so that we can overcome what he called the PR challenge with some of our constituents. I like that expression, but we've got to win that challenge. I hope we can. Hazel, you've got your hand up.
Yes, we've got lots of tatty little areas in the ward that desperately need to be tidied up for the looks of that. If we can get volunteers out and if we're able to take them out, are there any small pots of cash that can be raised in very small grants to get the plants to get them done, or any old trees we could get to put in there? Because no point just cutting and digging the area and then leaving to grow again. They want the volunteers to get tired of that. I'm just thinking of, small, very small amounts. Are there any available anywhere that we can tap into?
Thank you, Hazel. Deb Hill, I mean, you're the grant specialist. Would you like to comment on this?
I don't know about specialists, but yeah, I was going to mention we do have some funding this year and next year to continue with these kind of schemes, and we also have funding for 2 part-time staff called Communities and Nature officers that will help work in individual wards with the councillors and the communities to identify suitable areas for enhancing biodiversity, whether it's through wildflower management or tree planting or other habitat creation, looking at perhaps creating wetland areas or putting up bird and bat boxes, that kind of thing. So for the next 2 years, we're hopeful that we will have some additional resource to support this kind of work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We've got a large triangular piece in between 3 streets, and it's guarded on 3 sides by houses, and that would be ideal for development. And that's what I'm thinking of, really,
Yeah, great. Okay.
Yeah.
We could perhaps follow up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. Are there any other points? I don't see any other hands up at the moment in relation to this green space discussion, which I think has been very useful. I think there's a wide level of agreement on what the council is trying to do and what this paper is trying to express for the council as a way forward. This is not yet an adopted policy, of course, but hopefully it will be. I believe the Cabinet are looking at it in February, March. I think it's in February it will come to council, and hopefully together with our comments it can be adopted. Can I just draw attention, if I may, paragraph 2.3. First of all, yes, I was present at a presentation to the Swansea Nature Partnership a month or 2 back in relation to the cut and collect, and very impressive. I'm pleased to see that they've also, Butterfly Conservation have also presented to the council working group on these issues. I'm sure they will have been encouraged and very supportive of what the messages were. The following paragraph, very pleased to see Mark Barber here. Mark, of course, is the part-time biodiversity officer who was appointed specifically with a particular responsibility in relation to our Section 6 Environment Act responsibilities, delivery and so forth. But I wonder, I've had discussions with Deb Hill as Nature Conservation Team Leader, and I'd like to invite Deb. I mean, my understanding is that Mark is coming under considerable pressure in terms of his workload. And I do recall that when the Natural Environment Inquiry Panel looked at all of these issues back in 2018, we recommended the appointment of a full-time officer. And I'm just wondering, therefore, whether this is a point that we ought to be making, that this needs further consideration as to whether Mark's post needs to be upgraded from part to full-time. I'm not sure whether this is the right place to say this, but I'm conscious of concern. I don't know, Deb, whether you want to make any comment in relation to that.
Well, obviously, you know, it's a huge area of work with a growing, which is growing in its priority, and obviously having declared a nature emergency, we need to demonstrate that we are acting, you know, to deliver on that, as well as our corporate priority and our biodiversity duty. And there's no shortage of work out there, as we've obviously heard in this meeting, and this is only one aspect of the biodiversity agenda. So yes, obviously it would be great to have more resources. We do rely quite a lot on temporary grant funded posts, which are good and bring in, you know, extra help, but they are short term and people tend to leave to other jobs, and it is getting more difficult, you know, to recruit to those temporary posts. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate resources are really tight and there are other priorities, but obviously, you know, it would be beneficial to have a little bit more of a long-term commitment to funding, particularly that Section 6 post.
Yes, thank you. I don't know whether that we can. Other views on this? I mean, would the panel be supportive of including a recommendation that this post be upgraded from part to full-time? Would anybody object to that recommendation? It's clearly an important issue. Okay, I'll assume that we support that recommendation and we'll put it forward. Mark, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, just for clarification, the reason I'm not commenting is no other reason than obviously the role of biodiversity officer doesn't fall under my remit. So although I'm here as chair for this panel today, that would be under my colleague Councillor David Hopkins, and you know, so I'm not don't play an integral part in the employment of this post. So it would be wrong for me to comment. That's the reason I'm not keeping out of it. It's just not in my portfolio. So I don't know the detail of the part-time role versus full-time role, etc. So.
Well, thank you for that, Mark. We fully understand. I felt something I felt I had to say, because I've been aware of this problem for some time, and maybe even feel slightly embarrassed to have to make it, particularly in the presence of Mark Barber. But I know that he's working extremely hard under very pressing circumstances, and I think upgrading his post from temporary to full, or even extending the temporary status from 0.5 to 0.6 or whatever, would be helpful in terms of workload. But I would hope that we can include that recommendation. I see Hannah Lawson has joined us. I know that she was hoping to be able to join. Welcome, Hannah. Sadly, I think we've almost got to the end of our business. Is there anything you wanted to say on the paper, in particular on use of green space?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, sorry, apologies. I had a work commitment earlier. No, I think that in my ward, in Castle Ward, you know, we find that our green spaces are quite precious, because they're quite a small amount of them. They're a little bit few and far between. But I think I have noticed that there is quite an increased awareness and willingness amongst a lot of constituents to improve biodiversity in those spaces. I know that I've written to you previously on people noticing rare species of butterflies in Brynadon Park, and how Parks Department have helped by not cutting back some of the plant life that's very important to them there. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to working with Mark Barber and seeing how we can improve biodiversity corridors in our more urban areas, because although it's got a little bit more of a challenge when we've got a lot of concrete in our ward, there are also opportunities for kind of these corridors for pollinators and things like that. And I think it brings a lot of joy to people as well as improving our environment, you know. So
well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those comments, and I'm sure they're very much in line with the general thinking of the panel and the discussion that we've been having for the last hour and a half or so in this meeting. Are there any further points that anyone wants to make in something in terms of concluding? Mary Jones, sorry.
Yeah, it's only, I don't know if you're going to go on to it. It's about the draft questions or questionnaire for consultation. I want to make some comments about it, that's all. Okay, yes, by all means. Can I just say on question 1, yeah. Can you put other, because not everybody goes every day, not everybody goes once a week, and not everybody goes once a month, but they might go twice a week or, you know, twice in a day even. So could you put other, you know, on with a little box asking what, you know, what the other is. And the same with the third question, it seems to be you can only answer one of them. So you might only be going for exercise, but you're not. Yeah. You could be going for other things. So sure. Can you, I would say, can you tick the ones that, you know, they say on these surveys, you see, tick the ones that you do the most. That's it, really. Thank you.
I certainly think, Chair, on question 1 is a very valid point by sure. Mary. On 3, though, at the bottom, it does say either. So yeah, but what I mean is you do more than one thing if you go to the park. Do you see what I mean? Yes, yes. Yeah, also you can do more than one. Yeah, and I think that's easily rectified and very valid points. And I'm sure Jeremy and the guys will sort that out. But yeah, thank you for that. You know, I mean, you have an exercise if you're dog walking, but do you see what I mean? You could do more than one thing out of those. So you could tick 3 boxes, for example. Absolutely. Yeah, I see your point. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Yeah. It might be I don't do a lot of surveys, honestly. The PDC has actually appointed a small working group to look further at the consultation questions, and I sit on that. In fact, we had a meeting earlier this week on Monday, I think, Monday afternoon, to look at these questions. We're going to look further in a couple of weeks' time, so I take on board what you say and I'll report that. But I'm sure I can see there's no problem with your suggestions. But the consultation questions aren't finalised yet, and certainly open to further suggestions and thoughts. So thanks for that, Mary. Anybody else want to comment on the consultation questions, or can we conclude, what is it, item 6, and move on to item 7, which is the work programme going forward into the year ahead, if I can just find it. Oh, here we are. Yeah, would it be all right if I excuse myself now? And perhaps the officers can if they want to as well, please. That's right. If the officers want to leave and Councillor Thomas wants to leave, then I'll obviously do it. But equally, you're free to remain as far as I'm concerned, if that's of interest to you. I'll just pause for a moment for those that leave. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay. Right, I think those that want to leave have probably left. Yes, they have now. Mary, you've got your hand up. Mary Jones, sorry. Too many Marys and too many Marks on this committee. Mary Jones. Oh, you've taken it off. Sorry, you've removed your hand. Sorry, I've taken it down. Sorry. All right, no. For the work plan, of course, we've got the meetings that we've had up to and including today, and we've got one further meeting scheduled for 15 March when Paul Mellor, Deb Hill and Andrea Lewis, as the relevant cabinet member, will be here to talk about the work of the Nature Conservation team, project updates and so forth. And this, of course, is a regular occurrence in terms of our work programme. It's always going to be there at least once a year and maybe twice a year, depending on what they're up to. So there's no dispute about that. But
Well, some of you will know I'm not seeking re-election in May, for those that don't know that. So in a sense, my personal interest will end with that meeting in March. But obviously from the panel point of view, we need to look ahead over the rest of certainly 2022. If you look back over what we've been looking at over the past year since 22 March 2021, you can see the kind of issues that we've addressed. Some of those will recur. The Climate Change Action Plan, for example, air quality management, incredibly and growingly important that we become aware of the consequences of pollution, particularly vehicle pollution, for human health and indeed for wildlife too, and I trust that that will continue. Ash dieback may or may not need to recur as an issue, maybe just an update report on progress across the Swansea area. Local flood risk management is certainly going to be a recurrent item, particularly with the impacts of climate change and severe flood and weather events in Swansea and elsewhere. So those are going to be recurrent items. So in a sense, the work programme going ahead, also management of green space, of course, is almost self-defining. But are there any other issues that we feel, or members rather feel, ought to be addressed, maybe should have been addressed in the past but haven't been, but maybe we ought to be looking at in the future? Are there issues that we haven't addressed that ought to be, or can Emily and others simply build a programme around what we've been doing in the past? I've got none to suggest, but Will Thomas.
Just the planning enforcement, really. The biodiversity side.
That's a good. I would absolutely agree with that, Will. I think planning enforcement is a serious issue. It's been raised in relation to other discussions we've had, both in this panel and in other places. I mean, one of the things that we're aware of, and I recall from the inquiry panel, but in 2018, 2019, was the identification of lack of monitoring and enforcement of planning conditions attached to particular developments. And Wendy in particular, I'm sure, has got an interest in relation to that. That's
Could I just, the other thing is obviously, you know, where possible, to try and encourage biodiversity in planning applications would be, you know, something else we did touch on once. But, you know, if someone's putting in a planning application, could the planners, you know, encourage or recommend and look favourably upon, you know, things that encourage biodiversity? But there we go. Thanks. We have touched on that.
I think it's a great.
Yeah. Did I not mention that earlier, Chair?
You probably did. Sorry, Christine.
I did. Yes. Yeah.
Apologies if I've overlooked it, but thank you. I'm sure there's general agreement on that particular issue, which is a serious one. And if we're going to maintain and enhance biodiversity, we're not going to succeed if various planning developments simply override biodiversity concerns. Actually, I'm going to jump to Wendy Fitzgerald, if I may. I know she's out of sequence. I'm sure Wendy's got a view.
I was going to say I fully endorse that. I think that would be an excellent piece of work to look at. Can I remind you that we do have supplementary planning guidance on biodiversity?
Sure.
There is the policy now, and I will also remind you too that that was approved about a week after the very large planning application for 850 houses in my ward had got planning permission. So how convenient is that? Sorry to harp on, but you know, it is. We do have the guidance. It should be there. It should be taken on board whenever there is a planning application. But cynic that I am, I'm sure there are ways around it, shall we say? So.
Okay, I think there's general agreement that ought to be an item for the panel as we move into 2022. I think it's an excellent suggestion. I had thought of it myself in the past, but and obviously Christine also on the same thing. So that's great. Mary Jones. Mary.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to instill a note of caution. I don't want to give Emily too much work, because this obviously is the election year, and we have every year actually we have the Scrutiny Planning Conference for the work we're going to look at. So I think we've got to be very cautious about what we're asking Emily to do, because you might have to change it all. So, and we don't know the makeup of what panels would be, if this panel will still be here or if it'll be with something else, because people have been on about planning enforcement sits at the moment with a different panel. So you don't want to be doing cross, work either, panel work. So you need, be a little careful about how much further we're going down the road. There's things like the flood risk is going to come up somewhere. Somebody's going to have to look at that. I mean, it's something. They've got the new TAN. I've forgotten which TAN. There's too many. It was delayed, if you remember, or deferred for a while. It was meant to come in December. So, things like that we need to keep an eye on. But some of the other work, I think we've got to be careful that we're not asking Emily to go and do too much work, and she just really has a skeleton agenda really for going forward, just in case things change after May.
Thank you, Mary. I think it's helpful comments. I don't think I'm suggesting that we draft a work plan for 2022 all the way through now. I think these are just ideas to list that can be considered, as you say, at the scrutiny planning meeting, which presumably will be late May or early June, whenever it takes place. We will have these ideas. And I must confess, as someone who will not be on the council after the next set of elections, that I'd be extremely surprised and disappointed if scrutiny were to drop the natural environment panel. With climate change and nature emergencies, the last thing this council should be doing is strapping the one panel that is looking very seriously at how the council is responding to these.
Yeah, I agree with you. We did have to fight to get it, Peter.
Absolutely.
Well, I had to fight to get it, as you know, Mary.
Absolutely.
I was in agreement. It was trying to get off us a time.
You were. Thank you. Sorry, Mary Sherwood. Mary, the other Mary.
Yeah, I'm here. I'll tentatively put my camera on and see if my internet copes with it. I don't know if this is stating the obvious or being pedantic, but I completely agree with points already made about planning enforcement. But it's also about getting the planning conditions into the planning agreement in the first place, isn't it? And that I think it's known that we don't have enough planning ecologists to be looking over planning applications and inserting planning conditions, So while we do have the planning guidances now, and there is more biodiversity stuff in the LDP, making sure that planning agreements include the necessary restrictions or conditions and then enforcing them later, it's all part of the same package. I just wanted to stress that.
Yes, I would agree. Again, a planning ecologist, or more than one planning ecologist, was a recommendation of the inquiry study back in 2018, 2019, and it's only been partly fulfilled in terms of the appointment of the very good person that is in place, but has a very difficult task in terms of her capacity to meet all the requirements. So I take on point, absolutely, Mary, what you're saying. Got two hands up. Mary's a legacy hand from Mary Jones, perhaps. And Wendy, if you've got your hand up again. Or is that a legacy?
Yeah, sorry.
No.
I've got this problem too, never putting it down when it's up. Oh dear. Now I can't find it. All right, Christine. All right. Some of us.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Some of us have purer thoughts.
Yes, indeed. Oh, your hand has gone up again, Wendy.
I know. I can't get the wretched thing down now.
Oh God. Well, it's good to end on a note of hilarity.
Is it down now? I hope it is.
It's down for the moment, Wendy. Are there any other thoughts that people want us to record as a panel, purely in the minutes at this stage, of issues that the panel might want to pursue later this year? There's been some good suggestions there, and that's very helpful. If not, well, thank you all very, very much. I think it's been an absolutely excellent meeting. Good, we finished in time for Prime Minister's questions at 12 o'clock, which I think could prove very interesting indeed. And I certainly shall be watching to see what will be happening there. Could I just prompt people? I'm a member of the RSPB, as I keep reminding people at every opportunity. And it's the Big Garden Birdwatch on the weekend of Friday the 28th, 29th and 30th. The RSPB wants as many people as possible to participate. You can access the relevant questionnaire, or if you look to the RSPB site, Garden Birdwatch, you can see what needs to be done. And all they're asking people to do is for 1 hour, it needn't be a single hour, it might be bits and pieces over that weekend, to observe and count the birds that they see in their garden or in your local park if you prefer, and then to send in a return. Last year, I forget what the figure was, something approaching, I think 500,000 or more people took part in it, and they're hoping for more this year. And it provides a kind of a one-off citizen science count into the state of wild garden birds in particular. And that's important, and it does inform the ongoing data collection that is made annually into the state of our garden birds. Some species going up in number, some declining dramatically in number. Starlings, for example, have declined dramatically over the last few years, as I'm sure even here in Swansea it's fairly obvious, certainly fairly obvious to me. Other species, other like the house sparrow, seem to be doing quite well. I've got a regular mob of 15 in my back garden who mob around the feeders and frighten off all the other species, which is a bit annoying, but there we are. Anyway, if you can take part in the Big Garden Birdwatch RSPB 2 weekends time, do. I thought it's enjoyable and will help you to learn as well. Wendy.
No, I was really going to say, I think it's a really good thing to do. Peter, just for your information, the birds in my garden do not like the cheap fat balls from Home Bargains. So if you buy them fat balls, your birds fat balls, get the more expensive ones. They absolutely love, and it'll cost you a fortune to keep putting them out for the birds.
Well, I've got fat balls hanging in my garden, Wendy. I don't know whether they're cheap or expensive, but the birds love them. And if I hang up the hanger with 4 balls in,
that's it.
In 24 hours, they've all gone.
Absolutely. We sometimes have to refill twice a day because they are so fond of these particular fat balls.
But I also
nuts and everything else available, but they love the fat balls.
B&Ms are okay, Wendy, all right?
Peanuts and not hazel hearts, sunflower hearts are also very much enjoyed. But on that happy note, thank you to all. If I could have a word with Emily whilst everyone else has departed, just to quickly talk through how we're going to report on this, I'd be very grateful. So goodbye to everyone else, and please Emily, stay around. We'll just have a quick chat.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.